Certain moments never leave you. They hide deep within your thoughts and then reappear on the calmest evenings. Even though it has been 2 years since that night, and 2 years since everything changed, I still wake up to the sound of my own heartbeat racing, so you never know. Whispering reminders of what you did or didn't stop, I remember every detail of that night, including how the darkness in my room felt different, almost alive, and how my skin prickled as if something wasn't right, as if something was watching me. Then, slowly and repetitively, I felt a warm, wet sensation on my hand, which should have been comforting, but wasn't at first. You never realize that you could be the type of person who crosses the line until one day you do. And then there's no turning back. As my eyes adapted to the darkness, I realized that Tommy was at the door, sitting there staring at me with his head tilted and ears perked, almost confused. Almost like he wanted to warn me about something. But I still felt that warm, slow, wet sensation against my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my body turned ice cold. I thought it was Tommy, my dog, who always slept at the foot of the bed, curled up in his usual spot, always close enough to remind me that at least someone in this house noticed me. Let me start at the beginning. If someone had looked at my life from the outside, they would have said that I had it all: a husband, a son, a house that stood tall and proud on the kind of street where neighbors waved, but never asked too many questions. I should have screamed, but I couldn't. My body refused to react, frozen in place as my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening that night. That's when everything started to unravel, and that's when the truth, the kind of truth that changes you, came crawling into my life. A place where the front door was always locked, the windows were clean, and the grass was mowed. But inside those walls was quiet, too quiet. A silence that stretched out between us like an invisible chasm, widening with every year I was married. My husband Daniel wasn't a bad man, not in the ways that people imagine when they hear stories like mine. He didn't hit me, he didn't yell, he didn't cheat, at least not in the conventional sense. But somewhere along the line, he simply stopped seeing me. It's interesting how neglect occurs gradually, like a slow tire leak, and that one day you're driving along and the next, you're stuck, wondering when you lost control. Then there was my son Caleb, a lovely, quiet, thoughtful boy who wasn't a boy anymore, but was growing into a man. But I barely knew him anymore. The older he got, the more he pulled away, always in his room, always out with friends, always somewhere else. I told myself it was normal that teenagers needed space, but deep down I knew that it was normal. I would sit across from him at dinner and watch him scroll through his phone, answering emails with a furrowed brow. I tried to talk, but my words would vanish before they even reached him. So I stopped trying. He used to run into my arms, tell me about his dreams, and need me. But those times were scarce now, almost non-existent. I wanted to reach him, but the words never came out right. And after a while, I began to wonder if I even knew how to be a mother to him anymore. I wondered if he was leaving me behind, just like his father had. Sometimes I would find him sitting at the kitchen table with earphones in lost in whatever world existed inside that glowing screen of his. Tommy, my shadow and my dog. On some days, I felt like I already had nights when the bed felt colder. And even when Daniel was lying right next to me, there were times when we would tangle in each other's arms and fall asleep. My silent companion, the only person in that house who truly saw me, stayed close when the loneliness wrapped around me like a second skin, and would lay his head on my lap when I sat in the dark staring at nothing. He would follow me from room to room as if he was afraid that if he let me go, I might. Speaking in whispers, we slept with miles between us, separated by invisible walls, by everything we didn't say. I could have reached out and touched him, but I didn't because I knew he wouldn't pull me closer. There's nothing more lonely than lying next to someone who makes you feel like a ghost. So I learnt to live in that silence and accept it until that night, when I woke up to something warm and wet against my skin and realized I wasn't alone. I'm not sure what woke me up first. The sound, or perhaps it was something deeper, something instinctive, something my body knew before my mind did. I felt it before I understood it. A warm, wet sensation against my skin that was slow, rhythmic, almost soothing, and repetitive. My brain struggled to awaken, still stuck in a state halfway between consciousness and sleep. At first, it wasn't frightening. It seemed safe and familiar. I assumed it was Michel, my husband, when I turned my head and we briefly locked eyes. But I knew better since Daniel never looked at me like that again. Instead, it was Jacob, my son, who was staring at me. When I was in the kitchen brewing coffee, folding laundry, or sitting on the couch deep in contemplation, I would sense that silent presence. Those glances that lingered a bit too long before turning away. And then the touches of insignificant things that would appear innocent to others. The way he sat just too close on the couch legs against mine. The way his fingers brushed mine when he handed me something. The way his palm lingered on my shoulder as he went by behind me. And each time my stomach twisted with something I couldn't name. Something I didn't want to name Daniel. He didn't notice anything, hardly notice me anymore. And if anything, he had grown even more distant, buried in his work, his phone, and his endless meetings that kept him away from home more and more. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He didn't notice how my hands shook when I poured my coffee. He didn't notice the shift in the house, the way the air had changed, and perhaps that's why I didn't say anything. I should have put distance between us. I should have said something, set a boundary, and made it clear, but there was a dark, quiet part of me that didn't want to, because I didn't realize how much I had missed being seen until I saw someone truly staring at me for the first time in a very long time. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, and the narration was gentle and reflective with unease. Only a coincidence, a brief period of time between sleep and wakefulness, but the sensation persisted. The worst part was that I began to notice things. It began at dinner with a glance that lingered for a second too long, a gaze that lingered when it should have moved away. And I would feel it before I saw it. It stayed with me, creeping through the quietest moments and wrapping itself around my thoughts, like a slowly growing vine. The pressure of his gaze on me. He would be there when I looked up. Jacob was observing, studying, but not in the way a son would look at his mother, nor with the passive indifference of a teenager compelled to eat meals with his family. Instead, this was the way a man looks at a woman, the kind of look that makes your stomach tighten and your breath catch for a brief moment before you tell yourself that it's all in your head and that it must be an asterisk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Then came the innocent small touches that were so simple that I could easily brush them off if I so desired. A hand grazed mine as he passed the salt. A shoulder brushed me, and a palm briefly rested on the small of my back as he squeezed past me in the narrow hallway. I told myself that I was dreaming things, that every time it happened, my skin burned where he touched me. And even though I forced myself to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel guilty because he didn't mean it. It was only proximity that made my own mind convert nothing into something because I was desperate for attention. Came in waves every night while I laid next to my spouse, who was sleeping soundly and ignorant of me. Nothing had actually happened yet, but I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of something I couldn't name. Wasn't this already a betrayal? Wasn't it wrong to feel something when he looked at me? Wasn't it wrong to allow my body to react the way it did when his fingers touched mine? I was his mother, so that should have been enough to cut off any chance that something twisted, something abnormal. But the more I denied it, the more I felt it tightening around my chest like a vice. Maybe it was just me. I went downstairs for water to try to clear my head and remind myself that I was a mother first and that nothing else mattered. But I was so alone and desperate for something that I was turning this into something it wasn't. Perhaps I was so hungry for touch and invisible to my own husband that my body was confusing simple, meaningless interactions for something more. Maybe it wasn't him, maybe it was me. But why did he keep staring at me like that one night when I couldn't sleep? The thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. The guilt, the confusion, the questions I was too scared to ask aloud. He took a step closer, and I didn't move away. I should have walked away, said something, anything, but I didn't. And that's when I realized this wasn't just in my head. It began with the rain, and as the storm rolled in late that evening, the clouds swallowed the last of the daylight, turning the sky into an endless stretch of grey. I turned around, and there he was standing in the dim light, just watching me, silently still. And I swear for a moment, the air in that room changed, stretching tight between us, making it impossible to breathe. Another late night at work kept Daniel away from home, so I didn't ask. We sat in the kitchen, the soft glow of a candle between us, casting light and shadows across Jacob's face. He was staring at me again, but this time I held his gaze. I don't remember how the conversation started. Something trivial, but the way he spoke to me was different. There was no force. I didn't care that it was just Caleb and me, the two of us. The power flickered twice before the house settled into a quiet stillness. The only sounds were the rain outside, the occasional low rumble of thunder and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Small talk, no aloof responses. Purpose behind his words. A slow, measured weight to each sentence. And a pause between them gave me the impression that someone was truly listening to me for the first time in years. It was innocent, or at least that's what I told myself. At one point, I laughed aloud, a sound I could hardly recognize coming from my own lips. And then before I knew it, I could put it on file. His hand was on mine for a quick, harmless and simple moment of warmth. But neither he nor I pulled away. My mind cried out for me to get up and stop the moment before it became something we couldn't take back. But I was unable to do so because my skin was burning where he touched me. And my pulse was quickening, not out of fear, but rather something dangerous that I wasn't ready to name. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt like something wasn't right. I knew it with all of my being, but there was another darker, more desperate part of me that was sped. Does it feel wrong, or is it worse? The rational side of me resisted, saying, "You're his mother, this is wrong. Stop this before it becomes something you can't take back." But then there was the other voice, the one that had been buried under years of neglect, loneliness, and longing for something I couldn't have. But don't you deserve to be wanted? Don't you deserve to feel something again? A silent marriage? A long-faded love? Or this brief, intoxicating moment where I felt alive again? Jacob's fingers twitched just a little, as though he was testing the waters to see whether I would stop him. And I should have. I should have yanked my hand back and put an end to this before it became something we couldn't undo. But I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And something changed between us in that silence. I got up too quickly, almost toppling the candle between us, and I forced a smile, pretending nothing had happened, pretending my hands weren't shaking, pretending I wasn't falling apart on the inside. Jacob didn't say anything. He didn't push. He just watched me, his body language calm. But there was something dark and knowing in his eyes, and I realized I wasn't the only one going through this. That night, I lay in bed, feeling my husband's steady breathing next to me. His back turned like usual, his body inches from mine, but he felt 1,000 miles away. I could still sense the weight of something that hadn't even happened yet, but was perilously close. The ghost of it, the heat, and Jacob's touch on my flesh. Guilt is funny, because the more I tried to ignore it, the more it whispered back. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew it was already something. A soft, heavy narration, laced with something unsaid. I closed my eyes, willing the guilt to consume me and suffocate any part of me that had longed for that moment in the kitchen. I'm not sure what woke me up this time. Maybe the sense of being watched, the silent weight of something too close. Or perhaps I was secretly hoping for this to happen. When I opened my eyes, I initially believed I was alone, because there was still no movement in the room. The slow, steady rise and fall of my husband's back, his body turning away from me as usual. But then I sensed that I wasn't alone, before my mind could even comprehend why my breath was caught in my throat. A shiver ran down my spine and my pulse quickened. I turned my head, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and then I saw him. With his face partially lit by the street lamp outside, Jacob's expression was unreadable as he stood there observing me and my son. Yet something was visible in his eyes. I was unable to identify what caused my heart to race against my ribs and my stomach to tighten. I should have asked him why he was there, what he was doing, and why he was staring at me that way. But before I could do so, before I even had a chance to believe it, he whispered my name in a low, almost reverent voice, and something inside of me cracked. I should have gotten up and pushed him away to stop this before it got out of control and became something neither of us could leave. But instead I just lay there. He took a step closer, and the floor didn't creak under his feet. The air between us felt thick and heavy, with everything that had been building, everything we had both denied and ignored, buried under silence and snatched glances. He was frozen between fear, confusion, and something dark. I was unable to identify what caused my heart to race against my ribs and my stomach to tighten. I should have asked him why he was there, what he was doing, and why he was staring at me that way. But before I could do so, before I even had a chance to believe it, he whispered my name in a low, almost reverent voice, and something inside of me cracked. I should have gotten up and pushed him away to stop this before it got out of control and became something neither of us could leave. But instead I just lay there. He took a step closer, and the floor didn't creak under his feet. The air between us felt thick and heavy with everything that had been building, everything we had both denied and ignored, buried under silence and snatched glances. He was frozen between fear, confusion, and something darker that I didn't want to name. I forced my voice out in a whisper after swallowing hard. It was intended to serve as a warning, Jacob, to stop whatever it was before it became something we couldn't reverse. But my voice at God helped me. My voice wavered. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned and left the door softly closed behind him, leaving me alone once more with my thoughts, my shame, and the terrifying realization that everything had just changed, and there was no going back. I needed it to be, but it wasn't, and we both knew it wasn't. He didn't say anything, didn't argue, just watched me. I believed I could act as though I had forgotten about it, that if I buried it deep enough, it would fade into the background and blend in with all the other regrets I had come to terms with. However, some things never go away. They linger and alter everything, no matter how hard you try to convince yourself they haven't. And the moment I woke up the following morning, I was aware that everything had changed. I kept my eyes on my coffee and the newspaper, because I could feel it before I ever looked at him. The weight, the shift, the unspoken thing that suddenly existed between us, taking up space in the room like a shadow that none of us acknowledged. No matter how much I wanted to pretend that nothing had changed, it had. And there was no one doing it. Michel didn't notice. Of course he didn't. He never did. He sat at the table with us. I couldn't look at him, because I knew that the moment I did, I would see the truth that I had allowed something to happen, that I had allowed the line to blur. He didn't see my hands shaking when I raised my cup to my lips. He didn't feel the way the air had thickened with something dangerous. He didn't hear the silence between Caleb and me that morning as we sipped our coffee and engaged in small talk about things that didn't matter, like traffic, his schedule, and an email he had to respond to before noon. And for the first time, I hated him for his blindness, for his absence, because he could sit there completely unaware while Tommy was the only one who saw everything in that house, the only one who sent the shift in the air, and the only one who felt the tension growing with each second that went by. He stared at me with dark eyes that were unreadable, but full of something that looked too much like knowing, and I couldn't stand it, because there was no justification, no explanation, and no blurred lines in his eyes. I was drowning in something from which I didn't know how to get out, because if he had been paying attention, if he had seen me sooner, perhaps none of this would have happened. Simply put, I had crossed a boundary, and even if it had only been for a split second, a whisper of touch, an inappropriate breath, or an irregular heartbeat, it was still enough to alter everything. I made an effort to appear normal, to act as though every look, every minute spent alone, every brush of movement in the same room reminded me of that night, the guilt, the dread, and the weight of what couldn't be undone. But I could still go about this house and live my life without having the weight of what had happened weighing down on me. I told myself it didn't matter, that if I ignored it enough, it would go away. But I knew deep down that this was just the beginning, and that it would never be me. When you hear stories, you evaluate them objectively and convince yourself that you would never cross that line or turn into the type of person who allows or desires things to occur. However, one day you awaken to find that you are already on the other side of that line and that no one is acting in that manner. Again,